You're listening to INTERZONE Pod. My name is Gareth Jelley. I'm the editor of INTERZONE and its online sister zine, INTERZONE Digital. Subscribe to INTERZONE at interzone.press and read stories for free at interzone.digital. Joining me on the show today is Tobi Ogundiran, award-winning author of Guardians of the Gods, a new duology, and of the critically acclaimed short story collection, Jackal Jackal. Hello, Tobi. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Hi, Gareth. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
In your bio, you say you've called many places home. Where do you call home at the moment, and how did you get there?
I am in the U.S. South. I'm in Oxford, Mississippi at the moment. I've been here for about almost 2 years now, and I've got a year left, I guess. I'm completing my MFA program in creative writing.
And before living there, where were you?
Oh, I was in Russia for about 7 years. Yeah, I was in Russia for 7 years.
So you were in Russia, and now you're in the South, and you're a doctor, right? You recently qualified as a doctor.
Yes, I am a doctor. I qualified in 2021, so it's been a while now. Yeah.
Oh, time flies on social media.
I know.
Everything sort of telescopes.
Yep. It's like time really goes. But yeah, I graduated as a doctor, as a family doctor, a general practitioner. Yeah, that's my specialty.
And sort of Russia. You were in Russia. I mean, that sounds fascinating. What was it like, sort of spending a sort of a significant chunk of time there?
Yeah, it was real interesting. Russia was actually where I got my degree and my qualifications, and being there was kind of like being on a different planet because I come from Nigeria, and we are much more Western centric compared to, say, Russia. So being in Russia, I had to learn the language because, I mean, outside of like major metropolitan centers, no one really speaks English. So if you want to go to the store, you got to speak Russian. If you want to go to the pharmacy, you have to speak Russian. So it's like, to really immerse yourself in the culture and the society, you got to know how to speak the language. That was the first major hurdle, but it was something I welcomed because I love languages. I love learning, acquiring new languages. So that was fun for me. But also just acclimatize into a different worldview, social norms and all that. It was real fun.
And it has the language stayed with you, or has it is it that kind of thing where, use it or lose it, and it kind of gradually fades away?
It has stayed with me somewhat, I guess, because I don't use it every day now. So I really have to think sometimes to like recall phrases or certain words and things. But on the whole, I would say I've retained maybe 85%. I do have some Russian friends here, and we always speak in Russian whenever we meet. So that's fun.
Your first published story that I can find is Maria's Children in the Dark.
Yeah.
In 2018, which is a great first sale.
I know. Yeah.
Did they make you wait a long time?
And this was actually before I knew the Dark were like really notorious with fast or quick rejections.
Okay.
I think I waited about a month before Sean, who was the editor, and then Silvia Moreno Garcia was also the co-editor at the time, before they reached out to me that, yeah, they would love to publish this. And I was just over the moon at that prospect.
Right. Yeah. And sort of, when did you first decide to start writing? I'm kind of like sort of like thinking of like where you were sort of 7 years in Russia, and before that, before 2021, maybe. Had you, was it there that you sort of first thought, I'm going to write, or were the kind of first seeds planted a lot earlier?
Oh, yeah. So I always knew I wanted to write. And this was because I grew up in the Harry Potter generation, and, it was all the craze in Nigeria. And just seeing the success of that book, but also like the world, the imagination, and the hype behind it sort of made me really interested in crafting worlds of my own. And I started writing then. Unbeknownst to me, apparently, that I'd been writing stories even earlier, like now I have no memories of those times because it's my parents who told me like, yeah, I'm not surprised you've been writing ever since you could hold a pen. But so I started crafting stories in secondary school, and I would have my friends because I drafted longhand. I went to boarding school, drafted longhand, and I would have my friends take turns reading each chapter I drafted, and that was really, I guess, it did wonders for my ego. And I thought, yeah, I can make a future out of this, so to speak. And then I got into medical school, and the demands of medical school, writing just fell by the wayside. And then I seemed to just come out of this fugue of endless tests and exams and studying in 2017 and realized, damn, it's been a couple of years since I wrote anything. And if I continue this way, then I really wasn't gonna, focus my attention on this thing that is my passion.
Right.
So that's when I decided to come back to writing, but also actively pursue, professional publication and all that.
Those kind of early days, were you sending out a lot of short stories, or were you sort of taking it slow at the beginning?
In the early days, so I wrote a novel because, again, received wisdom is that if you wanna publish, you write a novel. I never knew I knew short stories were a thing, but I only encountered them in short story collections, Stephen King collections mainly. So I thought to myself, after facing countless rejections from agents, that maybe a short story collection would be easier to sell.
Okay.
And I was definitely naive, but I guess my naivety saved me in that regard. So I decided to write I thought maybe 12 stories would be a good amount to publish in a collection. So my aim was to write 12 stories, compile them, and try to sell that. But I wrote the first one, and then I somehow realized or discovered SFF magazines and realized you could actually get the individual stories published before, you compile them in a collection. And that's when I started I sent out Maria's Children and another story called Isn't Your Daughter Such a Doll? I sent out those two. And surprisingly, Maria's Children got accepted, and that just sent me, down this whole short story publishing experience.
That's really interesting. So you were writing longer things, and then you had this idea for this, this sort of collection, and now we have this sort of duology in the shadow of the fall. Before we kind of look at the conception of it, what do readers or what do listeners need to know about it?
Well, it's a West African inspired, specifically Yoruba inspired fantasy duology, which just focuses on Yoruba gods. Because I thought to myself, Norse gods and Greek gods are ubiquitous in literature and pop culture, but not so much Yoruba gods, and they're equally as cool, equally as exciting. And I really wanted to write a story that focused on them in the vein of classic adventure fantasy.
And was the idea for that sort of like does it sort of predate that sort of burst of writing short stories?
I guess so. For a while, I think in 2011, 2012, I fancied myself becoming a filmmaker, a director, and I thought, what would be the most authentic, but also really universal story to tell that would go beyond just the borders of Nigeria? And I thought, gods. Most cultures around the world have gods, and people can easily relate to stories about gods. And I looked at my culture and I thought, yeah, why not, put these gods on the world stage? I guess that was the first conception of the concepts of that story. Yeah.
Okay. And then and so it grew. Did you imagine it as two books as a pair, or did the kind of shape that it's in now, come later?
I imagine it as two books. Yeah, I didn't want to be locked into a trilogy, and that was mostly influenced by my own reading, I guess, habits as at the time I wrote these books, because I didn't think I wanted to. I'd lost, I guess, the urge or the zeal to wait on endless 5-book series, 6-book series, and just waiting for the next installment. And I thought maybe readers would really appreciate a story that was much more compact, told in lesser volumes, but also really complete. And so I imagined a duology, and that's what I wrote.
Almost, it doesn't sound easy, but it almost sounds like really sort of straightforward. Like, you decide one day, I'm going to write short stories, and then, you write them and you start selling them, the first to the dark.
Yeah.
You get an amazing collection out with Undertow Publications.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, what's the kind of publication sort of story like behind the duology? How did you pitch it, or did you have to do, or can you not say? I don't know.
No, absolutely, I can. I did. So I signed with an agent in 2020, but and we went on submission with 2 books, which ultimately went nowhere. And then I decided to end the partnership with that agent. And so here I was again, basically back to square one, no books. And I decided to write a novella, because this duology is actually based on a shorter story that appears in my collection. And I'd had folks read that story and they're like, yo, I would happily buy an epic fantasy trilogy in this world. Do you have something? And I guess that sort of made me realize that there was an audience for that particular story. So I decided to make it a novella instead. I wrote the first one, and I basically slid into my editor's DMs on Twitter. I was like, hey, I got this book. It's like typically what you acquire for Tor.com. Are you interested in seeing it? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Send it along. And luckily for me, he loved it. The whole team at Tor.com loved it. And that's how the story was born, I guess.
That's a really positive. I mean, there were so many publishing stories out and around, out and about, but that's a really positive example of just having the sort of taking your shot, like having the bravery to sort of ask and send it out. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I always tell folks to shoot their shots.
Shoot their shot.
Yeah, you never know. You never know where the yes is going to come from.
Yeah. That's right. So the second book in this duology, At the Fount of Creation, is out. I think I saw it January 2025. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So they're kind of like pretty close together. I suppose for a shorter book in particular, that's really good, because like readers are going to get these two things, almost back to back, right? Was that always the plan as well, to have them come out, relatively close together?
No, that was a happy accident, I guess. The team at Tor.com just decided to release it in close succession, and I think that works perfectly for this novel. So again, as you said, it's a shorter novella, and people, and I mean, the first book ends on such a cliffhanger that
right.
Early readers who've read it are like, yeah, I need book 2 right now. I need book 2 right now. So it is, and I guess it's some comfort. I hope it is some comfort to readers to know that book 2 is done. It's ready to be put out in the world, and there's not going to be a long wait between book 1 and book 2, and the story is complete, and they can have the full story in really a short time.
Yeah. Because it does end on a real. People are going to put it down, and then they're going to wonder right away. They're going to want to walk through that door.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you had, were the 2 novellas sort of being written side by side, or had you completely finished the one when you started the second one?
I'd completely finished the first one when I started the second one. And again, that's from my experience, knowing that nothing is guaranteed in publishing. So I wrote the first one, made sure that I'd actually gotten a deal, and, I'd been contracted for the second one before I started the second one. Because received wisdom, again, is that you shouldn't, especially if you're trying to sell a series, you shouldn't start work on the second one, because if the first one doesn't sell, then that's just time wasted when you could be doing something else. So I had to wait until I got a contract for both books before starting on the second one.
But it always ended in that way. It always had that cliffhanger there. There wasn't sort of like, shuffling things around once you had the second book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What's your writing routine like? You're a doctor, so I can imagine you've got a lot in your day. When and
Yeah.
how do you get your stories down on paper or on the screen?
Uh-huh. I try to, well, when doing sort of mindless tasks, that's when I allow my mind to brainstorm and come up with plot lines and scenes, which so I know by the time I actually sit down to write and face a blank page, it's not that I'm just staring at the screen, hoping for inspiration. I already know, the next steps, the next couple of scenes and what to write. So um, typically that's the case. It doesn't always happen that way, but I would say like 80% of the time, uh, I would have done my brainstorming and thinking, while doing other things. So when I eventually sit down to write, I just bang it out and really maximize, that writing time.
So you're writing, you're kind of writing that first draft very quickly, maybe. And are you kind of one of these writers who's sort of editing and tweaking as you go?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's me. I yeah, I can't I am trying now to be much more not as married, I guess, to the words I put down on the page and just try to get the first drafts, particularly the first drafts, done and out of the way. But typically, my first draft is the final draft because so if I write today, say, say it 2 or 3 pages before I start a fresh, day of drafts, and I go over what I've written the previous day, moving things around, tightening up the sentences, and then, to get back into the flow and the voice,
Mm-hmm.
and then I start drafting today's, and so by the time I'm done, it's pretty much set in stone. Maybe just a couple of things need to be moved around, but yeah, what you see really as a final product is more or less, my first draft.
Mm-hmm. Okay. With your first story, the one we mentioned, Maria's Children, that story is about halfway through Jackal Jackal. This sort of collection, this highly acclaimed, New York Times reviewed,
Yeah.
collection from Undertow Publications, and then there are also 2 originals that hadn't been published before. I kind of wonder, was the sequencing? How did you go about sequencing it?
The sequencing was really done by my editor, Michael, at Undertow Publications. So when I sent him the manuscript for that, for that for the collection, I think the opening is actually what we have in the final collection. So the first tale was the tale of Judge and Kanti, which is like a fairy tale esque story. And I remember bookending the collection. So the last story was also a fairy tale esque story, Deep in the Gardener's Barrow, but he shuffled some things around and moved things around. And the sequencing was really up to him, and I guess it's been really fantastic. I have no complaints whatsoever.
Well, now the stories are sort of out there, in print and in people's hands. Have you started, or maybe either through reviews or just sort of through like rereading, have you noticed connections between stories that you didn't see before?
Mm, I mean, through reviews, yeah, which I found really interesting because I never realized that I was sort of preoccupied with Western fairy tales, but also African folk tales and welding them together to sort of create something new, but also recognizable. Most of the stories there was a really poignant review in Locus by Wale Talabi where he said most of the stories have the hallmarks of fairy tales. So like transformation, repetition, and there's something else which I forget. And when I read that, I was like, "Huh, that's really true. That's an astute observation." So
Right.
it's been really fascinating encountering readers' response to the collection and the stories and how they sort of draw similarities and basically things I, as the author, never consciously intended to write or include in the stories. Yeah, it's been rewarding for me.
Now you have the duology coming out, and you have the short story collection coming out. Do you feel yourself kind of more drawn towards, more short stories, or do you find yourself more drawn towards longer works?
I think it's both. I think it's both because I spent a long time really crafting short stories, and I found that I began to love them. And really, short stories and longer fiction require two different skill sets. And I guess I've perfected the short story, but I also really love longer works of fiction. Not to mention, there are readers who would read like novels and novellas and never touch short stories. And there are readers who read only short stories because their attention span is short, and these two readers don't overlap. So I guess I would like to keep both faith in both worlds, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's a nice, that's a nice metaphor for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about film, about kind of having sort of ideas about making films, and in an interview with Paul Semmel, you talked about how The Lady of the Yellow Painted Library, how you thought it would make a good animation.
Yeah.
And I think In the Shadow of the Fall has a lot of images I can certainly see on the screen. Sort of it has got that kind of filmic quality at moments, that cinematic quality.
Yeah.
Do you think about your stories in filmic terms as you're writing them?
As I'm writing them, not explicitly in terms of film, but I am a visual writer. I guess it also comes from possessing an artist's eye because I'm a visual artist, even though I haven't painted in years. But and most scenes in my work sort of come to me as pictures or movies. So I see it literally playing out in my head. And I like to think the process of my drafting is basically transcribing the movies, so to speak, I see in my head to the page. So I guess that's what explains the really cinematic experience people get when reading my stuff.
And are you a writer who writes in silence? Do you need silence to get everything down, or do you have a soundtrack?
I'm always fascinated with writers who can write music, because I can't, because I'm also a musician. Like, I play instruments, and what happens is I find myself analyzing the music instead of writing. So I'm like, hey, that's a real cool chord. I see what you did there. So I gotta write in silence. Unless I'm at a coffee shop or something, and then I magically am able to tune out background noise. But if I'm at home in my study, then I got to write in silence.
Right. Okay. But no kind of white noise. Stark Holborn told me she had a 6-hour Joshua Tree desert ambience track.
Wow.
I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, writers and their eccentricities.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, so you've mentioned painting and you've mentioned music, and obviously there's the writing. So you're kind of you're creative in lots of different areas. Do you find your inspirations coming from multiple media as well? From films, from TV, music, art.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think sort of speaks to. I feel like the well-rounded writer goes out into the world and just soaks it all up, experiences the world, and that makes for richer writing. So books, movies, art, everything. I'm sort of like a sponge, and things bubble up in my consciousness sometimes years down the line, and yeah, it all goes into the cooking pot, so to speak.
The cooking pot for this duology seems like a really big one. It seems like one that kind of is sort of for you sort of culturally, and also I guess in terms of literary influences. Do you think a lot about your kind of literary influences as well as the sort of cultural ones, or is that not something you kind of worry about? You're just telling the story.
In the telling of the story, I don't necessarily think about the influences. I might have an example, or a work I'm trying to imitate, but usually that's just to get me off the launching pad. So when I'm about like 30% into the story, then I really know the story at that point, and my own imagination, my voice, my ideas fully take over. But typically at the beginning of the drafting process, I might pick up, have one book or a couple of books which I'm really trying to imitate, to capture the voice or the vibe or the general feeling of those particular books. Yeah.
And then when you're kind of when you're writing and editing, do you try to sort of stay away from things that you worry will kind of leach in, or?
When I'm editing, yes, I do try to stay away from things I fear might leach in. In the drafting process, no, it's like, yeah, everything,
Right.
everything I can get, I soak it all up. It goes into the first draft, and then by the time I've written the first draft, I pretty much know the story I want to tell. I might go back and take out some things, rework some things, just basically make the story my own. Yeah.
Right. Writing the two novellas, did you kind of did you find yourself facing, like solving problems or learning things that you just hadn't really thought about before? Sometimes with like longer works there are different challenges to shorter works.
Yes, I found the inclusion of the interludes, for example, was a really handy device to introduce other characters, other points of view. A really handy way of disseminating, necessary information, and it even plays in much more effectively in the second book, at the Fount of Creation. So that's a technique you don't always see in short fiction. Interludes. Short fiction, I say, allows for just like a really streamlined plot. It's like you go from A to B and that's it. But for longer work, you've got much more leeway to sort of veer off into side tangents, explore other things. But at the same time, it shouldn't, at least for me, I strive to make my work not unwieldy. So even the side tangents and the, other quests all have bearing on the main plot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That those interludes are really interesting, particularly because it isn't like one of these as you mentioned, like 5-volume fantasy sort of sagas. It is like it's like a tight two book sequence. I wonder, is the world is that world in that duology a world you kind of see yourself going back to, or is it closed off now? The characters are done, the world is done, it's on to the next thing.
There I do have a couple of ideas for to explore the world further, but these characters in this duology, I think I'm pretty much done with them. I could possibly write one more novella in this world, but it's going to follow a completely different character who also appears in these books. Features much more in book 2, actually.
Oh, okay. Who are some of your favorite writers, living or dead? And who do you go back to? Who do you find yourself reading again?
I absolutely love Le Guin. I think she's a phenomenal writer. Really excellent prose stylist, but also thinker and excellent human being on the whole. I love Stephen King. His ideas, his storytelling. He's what I call a storyteller, right? So he can take even the most ludicrous of ideas and make you care about it, which I think is a rare skill, which not all writers possess. I also really enjoy Neil Gaiman's work. There are a couple I'm sure I'm blanking on right now, but these guys, I typically return to them, again and again, just to study, pick apart their work and see how they made it work. Yeah.
King comes up so much, and it's really interesting, and it's sometimes just in terms of influence, also in terms of people who started reading him very early, you know. And King is one of those interesting figures, and it kind of it carries across multiple genres. So you'll find writers who write in all sorts of different places saying, "Yep, King, massive influence."
For sure. I remember the first King book I ever read was Misery, and I found that in my school library. And it was weird at that point, we couldn't take books out of the library. So I hid that book. I took it out from the fiction section.
Oh, that's great.
So every time I would go to the library, I knew exactly where it was. I'd go there, read a couple of chapters, hide it back. Yeah, it was.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really funny. So you kind of secret misery. That's great.
Yeah, I know.
Sort of career-wise, and you know, in 2018, that sort of first big sale, and then you know this duology coming out this year, next year. What kind of message would you have, or advice would you give to a writer listening?
They should read a lot and write a lot, which, you know, it sounds cliche, but that's what it is. If you want to get into any business, you got to study, you know, those who've come before you in order to better yourself. Particularly for the short story field, which it changes really rapidly. And, you know, some stories which got published, say, in 2015 will have a tough time getting published now. That's just the nature of the business and, you know, the whole social climate and all that. So yeah, read, you know, what's currently being published, get to know the magazines and what they want, not necessarily so you have to, you know, change or adapt your own style, but just to know what magazines will best fit what you're trying to publish. Most of my stories were published in The Dark and Fire and I guess Lightspeed. So I could never break into, say, Strange Horizons or some other magazines, and that's fine.
I think the first story of yours I read was in fantasy and science fiction. I'm pretty sure it was the novelette, right?
Yes, the novelette, the Epic of Koshido. And yes, the fantasy and science fiction were also one of those magazines I could never break into until Cherie came in. So yeah, that's what it is.
Right now, what are you reading? Which books have kind of made you happy recently?
Right now, I'm reading A Gentleman in Moscow, which is a phenomenal book, but also really not necessary, but applies to me because, you know, I spent a couple of years in Russia. I just finished reading Wally Talabi's Shigidi and the Brass Head of Obalufon, which also deals with Yoruba gods, Yoruba Orisha, but in a totally different way, not wholly historically fantastical way. It's set in the modern era. The gods and different pantheons around the world are actually like they've gone corporate. So prayers of the believers are now profits and shares, which they share amongst themselves. Really fascinating concept. Yeah.
Two very solid recommendations there. That's great. You've been listening to INTERZONE Pod, the INTERZONE show, with me, Gareth Jelley, and my guest today, Tobi Ogundiran. Find out more about INTERZONE at interzone.press and find Tobi's new book, In the Shadow of the Fall, wherever books are sold. And if you don't already have Jackal Jackal, you can get paperbacks or ebooks direct from Undertow Publications, undertowpublications.com, or from all good bookshops. Thank you so much for coming on today, Tobi. It's been really fantastic.
Thank you, Garrett. It's been a pleasure.